Last time we spoke about the ending of the Second Battle of Changsha. In late September and early October of 1941, Chinese commander Chen Cheng planned an operation to retake Yiqiang, a strategic Yangtze River city whose control was essential for protecting the approaches to Chongqing. Japanese forces were pulled back from Changsha, weakened by supply problems and casualties, which created an opportunity for Chen Cheng to intensify his campaign. Yiqiang had been captured by Japan in 1940, a defeat that Chen Cheng carried as a personal and political burden. He therefore moved to encircle the Japanese 13th Division inside Yiqiang and drive it into a collapse. Although the Chinese held a clear manpower advantage, 14 divisions against the encircled Japanese, progress was slow by stubborn fighting from prepared entrenched positions. The battle inside the city produced desperate close-quarters combat and heavy casualties, showing how the fate of Yiqiang and the wider defense of Chongqing were tightly linked. This episode is War Hits the Pacific. Well, hello again and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just wanted to remind you all, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and you can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. If you're in the mood for something not history, over at Echoes of War, we are doing a 3-part series covering the Thrawn trilogy. And if you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 41 episodes and ongoing at this point. You get early access to all the content I make and voting rights for subjects I will tackle next. The guns fell silent on October the 9th of 1941, as the 9th War Zone's forces restored their pre-battle positions, marking the end of the Second Battle of Changsha. The balance sheet was grim on both sides, but it was China that bore the heavier cost. The 9th Military Front suffered 70,672 killed, wounded, or missing. The concurrent Yiqiang offensive added a further 21,368 casualties to the 6th Military Front, a force that had outnumbered its Japanese opponents 10-1, yet still failed to retake the city. By the time the dust settled, the Chinese army had lost nearly 100,000 men across both theaters. The Chinese command was frank, at least in private, about what had gone wrong. The Japanese had moved with a speed that recalled blitzkrieg, advancing 130 kilometers in 11 days and withdrawing at 12 kilometers a day, catching the defenders perpetually off balance. The 26th, 37th, 10th, and 74th Corps had been picked apart piecemeal rather than fighting in concert. The original plan to destroy the Japanese south of the Milo River coming to nothing. Elite formations had paid a disproportionate price. The 74th Corps suffered 14,521 casualties, the 37th Corps 14,015, and the 58th Division alone lost 6,192 of its 11,907, nearly its entire fighting strength. Yet none of this was the story the public would hear. October the 10th, China's national holiday, the radio stations announced the second great victory in northern Hunan, the annihilation of over 40,000 enemy troops. Newspapers rushed out special editions. Congratulatory telegrams flooded in from government ministries and civic organizations. Senior officials seized on the moment. Sun Ke, premier of the Executive Yuan, declared that the victory laid the foundations for the counteroffensive and the recapture of Hankou and Guangzhou, while General Bei Changxi called it a pivotal moment for us to turn defeat into victory. Kai-shek, reading through the pages of triumphant commentary produced overnight by his propagandists, was reportedly impressed by their industry, if not convinced by their content. He had not wanted to call it a victory at all, but the political calculus was unavoidable. After 4 years of war, an exhausted nation needed the psychological sustenance that only victory could provide. The gap between public performance and private reality was nowhere more visible than in the arrival of the 22-member international press delegation October the 13th. Journalists from Britain, the United States, France, the Netherlands, Portugal, Hong Kong, and major Chinese newspapers were flown to Changsha and carefully guided through the selected battlefields, where they inspected mountains of war trophies and heard testimony from soldiers and civilians. They left satisfied, presenting their war souvenirs, swords, binoculars, Japanese military flags, to their audiences back home as proof of Chinese heroism and the Japanese defeat. Both China and Japan were claiming victory simultaneously. The only conclusion the foreign press could draw was that one side had to be lying, and it was not the side that had shown them the evidence. Chiang Kai-shek's real verdict came at the Third Nanyue Military Conference, held from October the 16th to the 21st. His anger was withering. He condemned his generals for their obsession with defending sprawling outer perimeter lines, while leaving city centers barely fortified, a mentality so rigid, he said, that the Japanese could announce the exact time of their advance and their withdrawal in advance and still execute it on schedule without any interference. Generals, what a disgrace this is. On the failure to capture prisoners, only about 263 prisoners were claimed across the entire front, of whom only 16 names were actually published, he was very livid. We can definitely defeat the enemy, capture many enemy prisoners, and seize countless enemy weapons. Even if we cannot capture 10,000 prisoners, we should at least capture 1,000. If not 1,000, then at least 100. But now you don't even have 10. The conference handed down punishments to match the rhetoric. Liao Lingqi, the commander of the shattered 58th Division, was sentenced to death for desertion, and he was shot on October the 22nd. His men were so outraged that 3 regimental commanders resigned in protest. The division was pulled from the order of battle entirely and given 3 months to rebuild. Li Yutang, the commander of the 10th Corps, was dismissed, though the Third Battle of Changsha would begin before his replacement could even take post, and he would be reinstated to play a key role in the city's defense. On the Japanese side, the 11th Army acknowledged 1,670 killed, 5,184 wounded, and about 14 missing, far fewer than Chinese claims, though post-war regimental history suggests the true figure was higher. Lieutenant General Anami, who had championed the operation, found himself stung by the charge that the battle had served mainly as material for Chinese propaganda. On November the 23rd, he reportedly reacted with visible displeasure when somebody in his headquarters said as much aloud. Anami's annoyance was easy enough to understand, but the accusation carried a troubling degree of accuracy. The Second Battle of Changsha had yielded no decisive strategic gain, and no substantial alteration in the military balance. What it did generate, rather effectively, was a story, and by the autumn of 1941, stories were one of the few things China still had in plentiful supply. The most consequential struggles were taking place not along the Milo River, but in foreign ministries and embassies, in Washington and Moscow, in the messages passing between Chongqing and London, and in the increasingly strained calculations of statesmen trying to determine, amid rapidly changing circumstances, whom to support and for how long. For Chiang Kai-shek, the challenge was never merely military. It was structural, and had been so from the outset. He had always seen clearly, precisely because he understood China's weakness, that Japan could not be defeated by China alone. The country lacked the industrial base, the logistical reach, and after 4 years of relentless attrition, more and more the manpower needed to force a decisive result on the battlefield. China's survival depended on making its war inseparable from the wars of other powers. Since 1937, Chiang's diplomacy had pursued that single objective, convincing enough great powers that their interests were aligned with China's, and holding that coalition together long enough for Japan to be subdued. That effort turned out to be vastly more difficult than it ought to have been. The problem started with the international order in which the war emerged. Chiang had hoped to assemble a concert of allies willing to help defend China against Japanese aggression. He was blocked, not just by the reluctance of neutral states to aid China, but by the speed with which alliances shifted in the opening years of the Second World War. He had never welcomed the prospect of a general European conflict, correctly fearing that it would push China even further to the margins of world attention. Even so, he recognized that once the lines had hardened between the imperial democracies and fascism, new alignments might become possible. From his perspective, the growing enmity between Berlin and Moscow was therefore disastrous. He had been eager to draw the USSR into a war against Japan. Instead, the Soviets were now effectively aligned with the Nazis, who were themselves allied with Tokyo. The world created after Versailles had already enraged many Chinese. After all, the May 4th demonstrations of 1919 had arisen directly from the settlement reached at the Paris Peace Conference. Yet that older order had at least possessed recognizable anchors, especially the dominance of the two great European empires and the United States. Now those empires were weakening, and no one could say with confidence what the new geopolitical order would be. For all Chang knew, Germany might emerge as Europe's new dominant power. The early years of the European War produced a bewildering spectacle of diplomatic realignment. The nationalist government had previously enjoyed a short-lived flirtation with Nazi Germany. In fact, Hitler's regime continued supplying Chang with munitions in the first months of China's war against Japan. The Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936 had theoretically joined Germany, Italy, and Japan into the Axis, but mutual distrust prevented them from forming anything like a fully coherent alliance. To be honest, if you're actually interested in the relationship between Nazi Germany and Japan, I just so happen to have made an episode over at Echoes of War. It's titled, What Hitler Thought of the Japanese, but it does look into the greater German public's feelings towards Japan as well. It should be coming out in mid-July. I also will be doing a full video on that very subject at the Pacific War channel on YouTube, and God knows how long it'll take me to edit that one up. Chang found it useful to imply to Western powers that he might be pushed into closer alignment with Germany, a particularly disturbing possibility for the USSR, which faced enemies in both Europe and Asia. But eventually the contradictions in German policy towards East Asia became far too severe. In April of 1938, Germany yielded to Japanese pressure and ended its support for China. Britain offered little meaningful help. Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister in May of 1937 at the head of a conservative-led national government, and he was quickly overwhelmed by the deteriorating European situation. If Czechoslovakia was for him a far-off country of which we knew nothing, China's fate was even more distant and obscure to many, perhaps most policymakers in London. The nationalists had more success in cultivating the United States. At the Nine-Power Conference in Brussels in November of 1937, the Chinese delegation failed to persuade Washington to impose sanctions on Japan and confront it directly. By the middle of 1938, however, American views were beginning to shift. As Japan pushed deeper into southern China, it became increasingly obvious that the occupied territory would be closed to foreign trade. In December of 1938, Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau arranged a private American loan of $25 million to China to be repaid through shipments of tung oil, a varnish product whose real importance lay not in itself, but in what the arrangement signified, a quiet American expression of faith that Chongqing would survive. Kai-shek also held onto the hope of an even less likely partnership. He had become fiercely anti-communist during the 1920s, yet in the early years of the anti-Japanese war, his greatest hope still rested on Soviet entry into the conflict. Soviet advisors and pilots had aided China from 37 to 39, but the USSR never formally declared war on Japan. Still, as Japanese aggression in northern Asia intensified, it remained possible that the Soviets would eventually be drawn in. Then, as so often happened whenever Chiang tried to impose some control over the course of the war, events beyond China's borders altered the struggle in fundamental ways. While Western attention remained fixed on Europe's darkening horizon, a battle with major consequences for East Asia unfolded on the frontiers of Outer Mongolia, Manchukuo, and the Eastern Soviet Union. Throughout much of 1938 and early 1939, one faction within the Japanese Imperial Army sought to pressure the Soviets along their eastern frontier. The USSR appeared vulnerable. Stalin's paranoid purges had executed or exiled many of the Red Army's best officers. In May of 1939, fighting broke out near Nomohan between the forces from the Soviet-backed parts of Mongolia and Japanese troops from Manchukuo. Within days, both sides had reinforced heavily until nearly 60,000 Soviet troops faced about 40,000 soldiers from the Kwangtung Army. Over the next 4 months until mid-September, they fought a major battle ending in a decisive Japanese defeat and establishing the reputation of one General Zhukov, who would later become one of Stalin's most celebrated wartime commanders. The much-derided Soviet army had fought with formidable effectiveness, and the result was not only a ceasefire, but also a non-aggression pact between the two sides, extinguishing in one stroke Chiang Kai-shek's hopes for a Chinese-Soviet military alliance. The final blow came after developments in Northern Europe. In the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, the Soviet invasion of Finland led Britain and France to back a motion expelling the USSR from the League of Nations. Stalin was enraged by Chiang's failure to prevent the Soviet expulsion, and mutual suspicion thereafter poisoned relationships between the two leaders for the rest of the war against Japan. China would now have to continue without further major Soviet backing. By the spring of 1940, China's position had become deeply precarious. In March, senior Japanese negotiators sought an agreement with Chiang Kai-shek in Chongqing, while Wang Jingwei was trying to formalize his rival nationalist government in Nanjing. This effort, known in Chinese as the Tong Operation and in Japanese as Operation Kitty, led to talks in Hong Kong from March the 7th to the 10th of 1940. Militarily, the nationalists were in grave danger. The United States remained neutral, and Europe was in chaos. Indeed, that same spring, with France seemingly near collapse, the British government also sent out discreet feelers to explore the possibility of a negotiated peace with Germany. For China, Western assistance was nowhere in sight. The Japanese judged the moment favorable for pressing Chiang towards concessions. Faced with serious danger to his regime, Chiang allowed the door to negotiation to open just slightly. As a consequence, the Japanese delayed full recognition of Wang Jingwei's new government. Through the summer and autumn of 1940, Tokyo remained uncertain about the defector. Prominent Japanese figures such as Count Arima Yoriyasu of the Privy Council said Wang Jingwei's conduct demonstrated his untrustworthiness, and Foreign Minister Matsuoka Yasuke continued to express interest in an agreement with Chongqing. Zhou Fuhai captured the defectors' frustration, men who believed they had made the highest patriotic sacrifice, when he wrote, "Chongqing sees us as collaborators. We see ourselves as heroes. We think only peace can save the country. That's why we think of ourselves as heroes. If we end up classed as heroes, then China-Japan will be at peace. If we end up classed as collaborators, then China-Japan will never see peace." That formulation conveyed something genuine about the moral dizziness of this entire period. Most of the defectors were not men devoid of principle. They were men whose principles had carried them to a place that history would find exceptionally hard to pardon. The new Fourth Army incident brought to a close one of the most consequential years in modern Chinese political history as well. The battle of ideas unfolding in 1940 was already visible to informed contemporaries. Early in 1941, U.S. Ambassador Nelson Johnson sent Washington a detailed assessment of the Chinese political situation in reply to another report passed along by Major Evans Carlson, an American officer who had made an extensive journey through the Chinese interior. The contrast between the two documents revealed a widening split in American views on China. Carlson, together with his traveling companion, the New Zealander Rui Ali, had become increasingly sympathetic to the communists after visiting their interiors in 1938, admiring their discipline. Carlson described the nationalists as moving towards fascism and argued that American aid should be conditioned on Chiang's government being compelled to adopt a more democratic institution. Johnson strongly disagreed. It was only normal and natural, he wrote, that the nationalists wanted to retain power. But during the war, they had established the National Political Consultative Council, in which multiple parties, including the communists, were represented. He also noted that the CCP could publish its own newspaper in Chongqing in a way that would have been impossible before the war. One might have expected the nationalists to use the war as a justification to extinguish all political opposition, yet instead they had chosen to muddle along. Johnson further thought that the influence of competing cliques inside the Nationalist Party had been overstated. Chiang Kai-shek, by contrast, had grown in stature, as he comes to be recognized as the symbol of united resistance to the Japanese encroachment. Ultimately, it is he who will make the final decisions. Johnson did agree with Carlson that Chiang's regime was hesitant to encourage broad-based popular movements animated by anything beyond anti-Japanese feelings, though he also pointed to nationalist cooperation programs and county-level reforms. But he rejected the idea that American support should depend on sweeping political transformation. Chiang was committed to continuing the war against Japan, and Washington should back him in that effort. In a notably far-sighted passage, Johnson wrote, "It is my view that since the fall of the Manchu dynasty and the collapse of the traditional Chinese concept of government, the Chinese people have been feeling their way along towards a new evolving form of government. A definitive form of government has not yet been established and may not be established for decades. It may or may not be in the form of a democracy, but it will be a type of government that will be adapted to the needs of China and her people." The tension between the two American interpretations, Carlson's idealized belief in the communists and Johnson's pragmatic support for Chiang, was more than a minor bureaucratic dispute. It would foreshadow a debate that would dominate American foreign policy for the next decade, and would still echo when the People's Republic was proclaimed in 1949. The disastrous experience of 1940 seemed to cast doubt on whether any future for China existed outside of the Japanese Empire. As 1941 wore on, another dreadful event shook the exhausted wartime capital. On June the 5th, Chongqing endured roughly 5 hours of bombing, driving the population into air raid shelters. In one tunnel in the Shibati district, the conditions were even worse than usual. The large shelter was supposed to have lights and electric fans, but the generators had never been connected. Inside, the air was dark, hot, and suffocating. Around 10 that evening, people began emerging from the tunnel when rumors spread that the Japanese were returning with poison gas bombs. Air raid wardens forced the people back inside, even as others were still trying to come out. Bodies toppled over one another, and panic spread as the people realized that they could not breathe. Over the next few hours, hundreds died underground in the darkness. The exact number was never definitively established. The official figure was 461, though a contemporary police report placed it at even far higher, possibly 1,527. What rescuers remembered most vividly were the tortured expressions of the dead. People tangled together in each other's arms as they lost consciousness, clothing ripped to shreds by desperate hands clawing at one another, and bodies so drenched in sweat that they looked as though they had been soaked in water. One survivor, Tang Jiangchang, remembered a hand reaching out from a pile of corpses and pleading, "Sir, please help me." The grip on Tang's shorts was so tight that it pulled them off. He escaped the tunnel naked from the waist down. Official descriptions of the disaster were softened. Even so, the tragedy deepened the city's gloom, and in a place already saturated with grief, it added a layer of darkness that mattered a great deal. However, events elsewhere would soon offer the nationalist government a narrow margin of hope. Late in 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the re-election as President of the United States. "I am not going to send your boys into any foreign wars," was something that he had proclaimed during the campaign against Wendell Willkie. But Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull both understood that Nazi domination of Europe posed a grave challenge to American influence. And with China's open-door policy to trade effectively shut by Japanese occupation, it was becoming increasingly clear that strict neutrality might not remain viable. In a 1941 report on China's domestic and foreign situation, Ambassador Johnson noted that during Germany's sweeping victories across Europe in the mid-parts of 1940, the Chinese had become anxious about whether the Allies would remain committed to their cause. Britain's refusal to surrender, however, together with continuing Soviet goodwill, lifted public morale in China. Then on June the 22nd of 1941, the world awoke to news that roughly 3 million German soldiers were advancing into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the USSR, dramatically overturned the non-aggression that had governed relations between the two major European dictatorships for the previous 2 years. It transformed the war in Europe entirely. Less obviously, it also transformed the war in Asia. Thanks to intelligence leaks, Chiang Kai-shek had already realized that war between Germany and the USSR was likely. After the neutrality treaty between the USSR and Japan was signed on April 13th of 1941, Chiang predicted that the United States would be drawn into the Asian War, and even that Japan might eventually reverse course and strike the Soviet Union. If that happened, China would become the critical Asian ally of both Washington and Moscow. Stalin had been caught off guard by the German assault, largely because he ignored increasingly urgent warnings from senior colleagues, receiving intelligence from very well-placed spies in Germany and the Comintern. Eager to preserve its alliances, now pressed the Chinese Communists to cooperate more closely with the nationalists. On June 23rd of 1941, the CCP Central Committee responded with a declaration that it would preserve in the anti-Japanese United Front, preserve in the Nationalist Communist cooperation, and would align itself with the British, the Americans, and others resisting the fascist rulers of the Axis. In Chongqing and Yan'an, the German attack on the Soviet Union were interpreted as a hopeful sign that Japan's fortunes might be beginning to turn. In Nanjing, the reaction was different. On June 22nd, Zhou Fuhai recorded in his diary, "Although the outcome cannot be predicted, members of the Nanjing regime all believe Germany will win and will take Moscow within 2 months." Zhou speculated that Japan could not easily reconcile its neutrality treaty with the USSR and its membership in the Anti-Comintern Pact, which was supposed to unite the Axis against Soviet expansion. Still, because Germany had struck first, Japan was under no formal obligation to help. Zhou had also continued to view events through a lens he had never really abandoned, that of Chinese nationalism. If Chongqing joins the Allies, and they win, then this is good for China. If they lost, it would be disastrous for Chiang Kai-shek. But because Huang Jingwei had established a government in Nanjing under Japanese sponsorship, China now had a foot in both boats. It was a ruthless calculation, but not a wholly dishonorable one. Zhou was not merely advancing Japanese interests. He was hedging, wagering on multiple futures in the name of a China he believed would endure beyond whatever constellation of powers happened to be dominating at that moment. Whether posterity would judge that conduct prudent or collaborative was a question he could neither settle nor live to see resolved to his satisfaction. The summer of 1941 marked a major geopolitical turning point in the war. Until then, the conflicts in China and Europe had remained quite separate, if desperate struggles on the Eurasian continent. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union now forced Japan to decide whether it too would enter in a war against the USSR. Debates in Tokyo were brief, although some officials, including Foreign Minister Matsuoka, favored striking north before moving south. Both the Kwangtung Army and the Navy advised against helping Germany, at least until Germany had succeeded in drawing substantial Soviet forces away from Siberia and then into Europe. Konoye, once again Prime Minister, agreed. With the northern option set aside, Japanese leaders turned towards another great power instead, the United States. Japan's failure to gain further decisive momentum in China had fueled demands for broader regional expansion, especially into Southeast Asia, with its abundant oil, rubber, and other strategic resources. From 1940 onwards, measures such as the pressure to close the Burma Road made it increasingly obvious that Tokyo had adopted a more aggressive posture in Asia. Unable to subdue China, Japanese policymakers chose instead to escalate the conflict still further. Japanese political life had become ever more dominated by the unresolved war in China. As early as 1938, military expenditures consumed about 70% of the national budget, and that same year, a national mobilization bill granted the government total war control over the Zaibatsu, Japan's major industrial conglomerates. By 1940, the new order was making itself felt throughout everyday life, with campaigns against luxury and extravagant consumption taking on new prominence. In February of 1940, a parliamentarian was expelled from the Diet simply for daring to criticize the Holy War in China. In such an atmosphere, retreat from imperial ambitions became increasingly unthinkable. That figure, 70% of the national budget devoted to the military, is worth dwelling on, because it reveals something essential about the trap in which Japanese strategists had placed themselves. The war in China had not been won, Yet abandoning it would mean admitting a failure so severe that would have shaken the ideological institutional foundations of military supremacy in Japanese politics. The only apparent ways out of required pushing further in. More conquest, more extraction, more expansion. The logic was brutally clear and profoundly destructive. The Roosevelt administration watched these developments with growing alarm. Though still formally neutral, the United States was already using Lend-Lease to provide major assistance to Britain and the Soviet Union in their struggles against Germany. It now expanded aid to China as well. On February 10th, Roosevelt's representative, Lachlan Curry, visited Chongqing to inform Chiang Kai-shek that the United States would soon provide $45 million in military equipment. General John MacRuder, head of a small AMMISCA mission, the American military mission in China, had been sent to Chongqing in September of 1941 as part of a quiet preparation for possible Chinese entry into an alliance against Japan. The China branch of the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, was led by General William Wild Bill Donovan, whom Roosevelt had dispatched also to China in early 1941. The Americans repeatedly tried to discourage Japan from moving south into Southeast Asia, but relations only grew more confrontational. Japan occupied the southern part of French Indochina, and in response the United States imposed an oil embargo in July of 1941. Great Britain and the Netherlands followed suit. The consequences were immense. Japan imported around 80% of its oil from the United States, and with Great Britain and the Netherlands added to that, it's something like 91%. Without its supply, its navy, the essential instrument for southern expansion, had reserves for perhaps 18 months. The real question facing Tokyo then was not whether it was going to act, but how soon. Unable any longer to resist mounting military pressure for war, Konoye resigned on October the 16th, and he was replaced as premier by Hideki Tojo. Tokyo accelerated its preparations for conflict with the Western powers. Plans targeted Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaya, the Netherlands East Indies, and the Philippines. And I should note, if you want to learn more about all of that fascinating history in greater detail, go over to the Pacific War channel, and I actually have a few episodes, including a brand new episode that will be coming out in mid-July titled The Road to Pearl Harbor. But there's also an episode I did that's a little bit interesting. It's in both English and French, talking about the role France played in the Pacific War. There's a strong emphasis on the battles in French Indochina, which almost nobody talks about. So please, if any of that is interest to you, go over to the Pacific War channel on YouTube, and please, if you do so, say where you came from. Tell me, you came from the Fall and Rise of China podcast. But I desist. Throughout the autumn of 1941, increasingly desperate negotiations took place between Japan and the United States. Washington insisted that Japan withdraw from China. Tokyo was equally firm that it would do no such thing. From the Japanese point of view, the demand to leave China was not a serious negotiating position, but a demand for national humiliation, a call to repudiate 4 years of war, vast casualties, and the ideological basis of Japanese militarism in a single diplomatic act. In the end, the gulf between the two positions could not be bridged. While civilian and military leaders in Tokyo argued over the pace at which they should move towards war, very few amongst Japanese rulers doubted the war was coming. At the Imperial Conference of November the 5th, it was formally agreed that if no satisfactory diplomatic solution had been reached by December the 1st, war would follow suit. Talks in Washington between Ambassador Nomura Kichisaburo, diplomat Kurusu Saburo, and Secretary of State Cordell Hull went nowhere. On November the 26th, Hull delivered a note repeating the American position that Japan must withdraw from both China and Indochina. On December the 1st, the Imperial Conference resolved to go to war. The following day, the date of the attack was fixed as December the 8th, December the 7th by American time. In one sense, this was the culmination towards which the entire previous decade had been moving. The war in China had started as a localized conflict, then expanded into a continental one, and was now about to become something much larger still, a truly global war, stretching from the North Atlantic to the Western Pacific. China's long, lonely resistance would suddenly gain new dimensions and new allies, though not the ones Chiang Kai-shek had spent 4 years trying to cultivate, and not under circumstances he would have chosen. In the early morning of December the 7th of 1941, The U.S. Pacific Fleet lay anchored at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, its sailors and officers still largely asleep as dawn crept across the Pacific. The attack did not come without warnings. American Japanese diplomats had been locked in increasingly desperate negotiations throughout the autumn, each side hardening its position until no room remained to maneuver. Washington had demanded that Japan withdraw from China, a condition Tokyo viewed not as a serious opening offer, but as a demand for national humiliation. A call to repudiate 4 years of brutal war, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and the entire ideological foundation upon which Japanese militarism rested. No agreement was possible. Both sides privately knew this. The strike force assembled in secret was formidable. The Kido Butai, 6 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zoikaku, had sailed under strict radio silence across the North Pacific, launching their aircraft in 2 successive waves before the American base had any meaningful chance to respond. The first wave of approximately 183 planes swept in just before 8 a.m., targeting the rows of battleships moored along Battleship Row and the military airfields at Wheeler, Hickam, and Ford Island simultaneously, ensuring that American aircraft could not scramble in time to mount an effective defense. A second wave of about 170 planes followed less than an hour later, pressing the attack on the damaged ships and the harbor installations. The destruction was staggering. The battleship Arizona suffered a catastrophic magazine explosion after an armor-piercing bomb penetrated her forward decks, killing nearly 1,177 of her crew in minutes, almost half of the total American deaths from the entire attack. The Oklahoma capsized after being struck by multiple torpedoes. The West Virginia and California sank at their moorings. In total, 17 vessels were damaged or destroyed, and the vast majority of military aircraft at the nearby airfields were caught on the ground and obliterated before they could even take flight. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, and another 1,000 or more were wounded, making it the deadliest single attack on American soil or territory in the nation's history to that point. But the attack was not a complete strategic success for Japan. The U.S. Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, the vessels that would ultimately decide the naval war in the Pacific, happened to be at sea that very morning, and they escaped any harm. The harbor's fuel storage and repair facilities were also left largely intact, allowing the fleet to reconstitute faster than Japanese planners had anticipated. What Japan had achieved in a tactical devastation, it partly squandered in strategic miscalculation. The attack ended American neutrality instantly. The following day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December the 7th a date which will live in infamy. Within hours, the United States declared war on Japan. For China, after more than 4 years of fighting alone, the blow that devastated Pearl Harbor paradoxically carried a thread of desperate hope at last. The great power Chiang Kai-shek had spent years trying to draw into the conflict had arrived. It wasn't under the circumstances he would have chosen, but it had arrived nonetheless. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if you were looking for even more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, where you can check out my latest episode, The Road to Pearl Harbor. And if you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, get early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. After years of fighting, China's situation darkened in 1941, with intense bombing of Chongqing and fears of poison gas attacks. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June shifted alliances and pressured Japan towards a wider war. Japan escalated plans for Southeast Asia, suffered an oil embargo, and negotiations with the United States broke down over withdrawing from China and French Indochina. Then the Pearl Harbor attack began the Pacific War.